We're going to focus our analysis today on a case that is just, well, it's uniquely tragic.
It really is.
It's defined by a shocking level of betrayal,
Yeah.
this senseless violence, and it also resulted in the creation of a really powerful legislative legacy.
And this is a discussion that, it demands sensitivity. It demands a rigorous focus on the facts.
Absolutely.
Our mission here is to carefully dissect the complete chronology of events. Everything from the initial failure of the missing person system to the shocking details of the crime itself. A crime committed by people Skylar considered her closest friends.
And we'll also analyze the investigative process, which was quite lengthy, the criminal charges that followed, and maybe most importantly for you listening, the lasting beneficial change that came from this, the creation of Skylar's Law.
Right.
That legislative change is so central to understanding the full impact of this case. It's not just some tragic footnote. It's an instance where bureaucracy was forced to bend to reality. It corrected systemic failures that put vulnerable teenagers at risk.
Precisely. The facts surrounding Skylar's loss, they forced a complete statewide reevaluation of how missing person procedures operated in West Virginia. So we're going to be sticking strictly to the facts that are provided in the source material to make sure we understand the events, the motivations, however incomprehensible they might be, and the specific legal and legislative outcomes that followed.
Right. We need to go beyond just the summary and really get into the details that led to this systemic shift. Okay, so let's begin by grounding ourselves in the victim and the setting. We're talking about Skylar Neese, who was born in 1996. At 16, the sources really paint a picture of a vibrant young woman, someone with a clear sense of ambition.
Skylar was deeply rooted in her community. This was in Star City, Monongalia County, West Virginia. She was known as an honor student at University High School.
And her aspirations they weren't typical teenage whims. She had a definite plan.
Not at all. She wanted to become a criminal defense attorney. I mean, that desire for such a demanding career, it really speaks volumes about her intelligence, her commitment to her academic life.
And like so many ambitious high school students, she was already working. She held shifts at a local Wendy's, earning money, maintaining a regular routine.
And that routine is what makes her sudden disappearance all the more alarming.
Exactly.
Her family life, it sort of mirrored that normalcy. Skylar was the only child of Mary and Dave Neese. Mary was an administrative assistant at a cardiac lab, and Dave worked as a product assembler at Walmart.
So a close-knit, typical working family.
Yes, which only intensifies the devastation when this unimaginable event just breaks into their stable existence.
So the sources then introduce the two individuals whose names are now, forever linked with this tragedy. Her friends, who became her murderers. We'll start with the one who had the longest history with Skylar, Shalia Ray Eddy.
Shalia Ray Eddy was born in 1995, so about 9 months before Skylar. Their history goes way back to when they were 8 years old. They met at a children's activity program that was known locally as The Shack.
So they grew up together.
For a long time, yes. Their relationship endured through a lot of changes. Eddie's parents had divorced after her father suffered a traumatic brain injury back in 2000. And when Eddie's mother remarried and moved to Morgantown in 2010, Shalia started attending University High School, which, cemented her closeness to Skylar.
So she wasn't some recent acquaintance.
Not at all. She was part of Skylar's foundational life experience.
And then there's Rachel Elizabeth Schoaf. She was born around the same time as Skylar in 1996.
Right.
Schoaf entered the picture a little later, which, in the context of high school friendships, that can sometimes lead to different dynamics.
That's right. Rachel Schoaf was raised by her parents, Rusty and Patricia Schoaf, also in the Morgantown area. She actually started her education at a private Catholic school, but then she transferred to University High School, and that's where she met both Skylar Neese and Shalia Eddy.
So while Eddy and Neese had this history going back almost a decade, Schoaf comes in and completes the trio.
Yes, and they quickly became inseparable.
Now, the sources do make a point of discussing the initial speculation around the motive. This idea that tension arose from a romantic relationship between Eddy and Schoaf, and that Skylar was somehow interfering.
And that narrative initially complicated the search immensely.
How so?
Well, it gave investigators this complex personal drama to focus on, and that potentially distracted them from the true, much darker, premeditated plan. It's really crucial for you to note that this initial tension point, it was later revealed to be secondary to the actual motive provided in the confession.
So we have to separate the public speculation from the truth.
The chilling truth that emerged 6 months later, yes. For now, the key point is that these were 3 girls who presented this unified front, bonded by school and social life, but they were masking a really toxic dynamic just beneath the surface.
The sources seem to suggest that the bond between Eddie and Shoaf grew increasingly tight, and that led to a deliberate exclusion of Skylar.
It did. The sources highlight these subtle shifts, a sudden withdrawal, conversations stopping when Skylar entered a room, and more whispered discussions between Eddie and Shoaf.
So it wasn't a sudden snap.
No, it was a slow, calculated move toward alienation. And that makes the ultimate act of violence appear that much more sinister because it followed this clear emotional coldness.
It really sets the stage for betrayal on an almost unimaginable level. A slow, simmering resentment that somehow escalated from just ending a friendship to planning a murder.
Exactly. And the fact that this deep emotional fracture existed beneath the surface of what was, to the Neese family and the wider community, a healthy, close friendship, that is what makes the forthcoming narrative so difficult to process.
The ability of the two perpetrators to maintain that facade for so long is just.
It's a terrifying aspect of this case.
Let's trace the timeline precisely. We need to focus on the night of July 5th into July 6th, 2012. That's when Skylar Neese was last seen.
Right. Skylar returned home to her apartment after her shift at Wendy's on the evening of July 5th.
And this is where the sequence of events becomes absolutely critical.
We have specific, hard evidence of her movements. There's surveillance footage from the apartment complex that captured Skylar leaving her apartment through her bedroom window at precisely 12:30 a.m. on July 6th.
Okay, so she's seen leaving.
She was seen getting into a light-colored sedan that was waiting outside.
Leaving through the window immediately suggests she was sneaking out to meet someone she knew, probably against her parents' wishes.
Mm-hmm.
It provides that initial veneer of a planned voluntary departure.
And that is the critical ambiguity that plagued the initial investigation. But, if you look at the physical evidence Skylar left behind, it screams that she intended to return probably within the hour.
What kind of evidence?
Her father, Dave Neese, documented it. She left behind her cell phone charger, which is an absolute necessity for a teenager, and she also left her contact lenses and the essential solution for cleaning them.
That's a powerful detail. No teenager, especially one who had to work the next day, would intentionally leave those items if they planned to run away or stay out indefinitely.
Correct. The open window, the presence of these essential daily use items, it provided immediate counter evidence to the whole runaway theory.
Yet initially, law enforcement fixated on the act of sneaking out.
They interpreted it as voluntary flight.
And that light-colored sedan, the initial mystery around who was in it was solved far too late, and that just prolonged the suffering of the Neese family.
Yes. Investigators spent weeks pursuing all sorts of leads. It wasn't until the early fall of 2012 that they really focused heavily on that surveillance footage.
And when they did,
When confronted with the evidence, Shalia Eddy, Skylar's best friend, was eventually forced to admit that the car was hers. She confirmed she was the driver.
but she coupled that admission with a devastating lie.
A devastating lie. She claimed she had dropped Skylar off an hour later, suggesting Skylar had successfully returned home or gone somewhere else voluntarily. And that lie, it anchored the runaway theory for months.
And that brings us to the core systemic failure in this investigation. The inability to issue an immediate, broad alert.
Exactly.
Law enforcement classified Skylar as a runaway.
Yeah.
And that triggered this cascading series of procedural obstacles.
This is where we need to explain the bureaucratic rigidity that existed in West Virginia at the time. This is what would later be the target of Skylar's Law, an Amber Alert, which, mobilizes the entire public broadcast system. It was not issued.
Why not?
Because the circumstances of Skylar's disappearance failed to meet all 4 of the strict criteria required for activation.
Let's walk through those criteria as they existed back in 2012, because understanding their strictness is really key to understanding why the legislative change was so necessary.
Okay, so the 4 criteria were highly specific. They were designed only for clear, stranger-initiated abductions. First, the child must be believed to have been abducted. That means foul play or kidnapping has to be immediately suspected.
Which it wasn't in this case.
Right. Second, the child must be under the age of 18. Third, the child must be in immediate danger of death or serious injury. And fourth, authorities have to have sufficient descriptive information available to make the alert useful in the recovery effort.
So because authorities initially classified Skylar as a runaway, a teenager who voluntarily left, they didn't meet that first critical criterion, the abduction requirement.
Exactly. Since the law enforcement interpretation was that she left voluntarily, the premise of an abduction just wasn't met.
Sure.
And furthermore, and this is maybe the most egregious procedural flaw, there was a mandatory minimum 48-hour waiting period that had to pass before a teenager could be considered officially missing and warrant such an alert.
Regardless of suspicion.
Regardless of suspicion.
We all know that in missing persons investigations, especially with minors, those first 48 hours are often called the golden hours. They're the most critical window for recovery. That mandatory wait essentially handed the perpetrators a massive 2-day head start.
It was a catastrophic delay. By classifying her as a potential runaway, the official urgency was just diffused. The system essentially said, wait and see. This procedural constraint meant that the search remained localized and low priority during the time when the greatest chance for immediate discovery existed.
Her parents, of course, they didn't wait.
No.
They immediately printed and distributed flyers all across Monongalia County. But without the institutional backing of an Amber Alert, those initial efforts were simply one family against a huge geographical area, compounded by that constant, agonizing uncertainty.
The initial phase was just this confluence of Eddie's elaborate lie and the bureaucratic rigidity of the state laws. Law enforcement was pursuing leads like a false tip that suggested Skylar was seen in North Carolina, while the truth in Skylar's body lay less than 30 miles away across the state line in Pennsylvania. The system, based on these narrow definitions, was designed for a scenario that just did not account for the specific type of planned internal betrayal.
When the full scope of the crime was finally revealed through the confession, the details confirmed that this was not some impulsive act. This wasn't fueled by a teenage argument.
No, not at all.
This was a crime that demonstrated profound premeditation. The sources detail a shocking level of preparation on the part of Shalia Eddy and Rachel Schoaf.
The element of calculated planning is what truly distinguishes this case. Court transcripts reveal that before they even picked up Skylar, Eddy and Schoaf meticulously assembled a murder kit. They concealed it in the trunk of Eddy's light-colored sedan.
So this confirms they weren't just driving around hoping for a fight.
No, they were driving to carry out an execution.
What were the specific items that they hid in the trunk that night?
They stored everything necessary for cleanup and disposal. This included multiple cleaning rags, a bottle of bleach, wet wipes, and a shovel, which they intended to use to bury the body.
And crucially, they also packed clean outfits for themselves.
Yes. This entire setup, planning the clothing change, the cleanup, it shows a cold, rational attempt to minimize forensic evidence and maximize their chances of just returning to their normal lives seamlessly.
And the weapons themselves. Where did they keep them?
They brought 2 knives. The sources indicate the knives were wrapped in towels and tucked under their arms as they left their homes.
So they maintained that deception even as they walked into Skylar's presence.
Yes. They picked up Skylar at 12:30 a.m., and Skylar, trusting them implicitly, climbed into the back seat, completely unaware of the arsenal and the clean clothes waiting for her in the truck.
They then drove across state lines, which that's a detail that later complicated the legal proceedings. They drove to Brave, Pennsylvania. Why that specific location?
They chose a remote, wooded location in Wayne Township, Greene County, Pennsylvania. It was specifically selected because all 3 girls were familiar with it. They'd gone there before to smoke marijuana.
So the familiarity provided confidence.
Confidence that the spot was secluded and that they could navigate their way in and out quickly. It was less than 30 miles from Star City, but crucially, it was across the border in the rutted Pennsylvania countryside.
The actual execution of the murder was based on a cruel and manipulative deception designed to ensure Skylar was defenseless.
Absolutely. Once they arrived at the remote spot, the 3 girls got out of the car. The perpetrators, Schoaf and Eddy, then feigned this casual moment of forgetfulness. They claimed they had forgotten to bring a lighter for their planned activity.
And Skylar, still trusting them, turned her back to go get the lighter from the car.
And that turning of her back was the signal. Yep. It was. The sources detail a sickening moment of final preparation. Schoaf and Eddy counted to 3.
And on the count of 3.
On the count of 3, they immediately launched their attack, stabbing Skylar Neese repeatedly with the 2 concealed knives.
But the initial attack didn't immediately subdue Skylar. The sources describe a desperate, violent struggle for survival.
She fought back with ferocity. She tried to run instantly, but she was tackled by Schoaf. The stabbing continued as she struggled against both of them.
And in a moment of sheer desperation and self-defense,
Neese managed to grab the knife held by Rachel Schoaf and stabbed Schoaf above the ankle. This injury is documented in the sources as a critical turning point in the sequence of events.
That injury may have caused Shoaf to pause, but it seems Eddie was just relentless.
That's the distinction Shoaf tried to draw later in her confession. She claimed she stopped the assault after she was injured. However, the attack didn't stop.
Eddie continued.
Eddie continued stabbing Skylar Neese until, as Shoaf recounted to investigators, there was complete silence and, chillingly, until Neese's neck stopped making weird sounds. The sheer brutality and persistence of that attack, particularly by Eddie, confirms a profound malicious intent that went far beyond just ending a friendship.
After the murder, they immediately moved into the concealment phase, using the tools they had brought.
Yes, though their disposal plan ran into an unforeseen obstacle. Their plan failed because the Pennsylvania countryside wasn't very accommodating. They had intended to bury the body using the shovel, but the sources confirmed the ground was too hard, too rocky.
So they couldn't dig a sufficient grave.
Right. This failure forced a rapid change in plan. Instead of a proper burial, they simply covered Skylar's body with a makeshift camouflage of branches, dirt, and leaves.
They then enacted the cleanup they had planned for, changing out of their bloody clothes and sanitizing the area.
They changed into their clean outfits, meticulously wiped down themselves and the interior and exterior of the car using the wet wipes and bleach, trying to eliminate any forensic evidence.
And then they just left.
They left the scene. And despite their thorough cleanup effort, that flawed concealment, the failure to bury the body, would eventually prove critical when Shoaf led investigators back to the location months later. They returned to their normal lives in Monongalia County, having committed premeditated murder and leaving their best friend hidden in the woods.
It is just staggering that these two girls, Shalia Eddy and Rachel Shoaf, could commit this level of violence and then just return to their lives, maintaining this facade for months. How long did that lie hold up, and what was the impact on the investigation?
That facade held up for approximately 6 agonizing months for the Neese family. The initial classification of Skylar as a runaway meant the case just stagnated until the fall of 2012. It was in September 2012 that the gravity of the disappearance finally brought in the FBI and the West Virginia State Police.
And that brought in serious resources.
Forensic specialists, behavioral analysts, trained interrogators, they all joined the search.
This heightened pressure must have targeted Skylar's circle of friends. And Shalia Eddy, who was already caught in one lie about the car, was now under intense scrutiny.
Eddie's deception during this period is truly shocking. I mean, she not only maintained her lie that she had dropped Skylar off safely an hour after picking her up, but she actively participated in the public search efforts.
What do you mean?
The sources highlight that Eddie assisted the family in distributing missing person flyers. She attended vigils. She acted the part of the grieving, worried friend.
That level of duplicity. It must have been devastating to the Neese family when the truth finally emerged.
Dave Neese, Skylar's father, explicitly stated the depth of that betrayal. He emphasized that these two girls were Skylar's closest friends, welcomed into their home. Eddie's continued cold-blooded performance right alongside the parents she had victimized, it profoundly prolonged their emotional trauma and prevented the truth from surfacing for so long.
And her false narrative just diverted the focus.
It diverted the focus away from the Monongalia County, Greene County area for nearly half a year.
So if Eddie was so effective at maintaining this lie, what finally triggered the break in the case 6 months later, in January of 2013?
The break came through Rachel Shoaf, specifically due to overwhelming psychological distress.
A breakdown.
A profound nervous breakdown. In January 2013, the sources note that her mother was forced to call 911, and during that emergency call, Shoaf could be heard screaming intensely in the background. This psychological rupture led to her immediate hospitalization in a local psychiatric facility where she stayed for 5 days.
The pressure of covering up a premeditated murder. It seems that was the only thing that could shatter their conspiracy of silence.
It was the breaking point. The moment Shoaf was released from the hospital, she didn't go home. She went straight to her lawyer.
And in her lawyer's office.
It was there that she confessed fully, detailing how she and Eddie had planned and carried out the murder together. This single event transformed the case immediately from a cold missing person search into an active homicide investigation with identified perpetrators.
And with the confession, investigators finally had the one piece of information that had eluded them: the location of Skylar's body.
Shoaf led them right back to that remote location in Wayne Township, Greene County, Pennsylvania. It was the site where they had failed to bury the body 6 months earlier. The body, which had actually been stumbled upon by local authorities back on January 16th, 2013, was finally positively identified following Schoaf's detailed confession.
And it was confirmed.
The U.S. Attorney, William J. Eilenfeld II, confirmed on March 13th, 2013, that the remains belonged to Skylar Neese. The final confirmation was that she had been hidden less than 30 miles from her own bedroom.
When we look at the motive that Schoaf provided, the explanation for this entire calculated operation, it remains maybe the most profoundly unsettling element of the entire case.
It's the detail that truly defies human logic and compassion. The prosecution pressed Schoaf for the reason behind this elaborate plan, this violence, and her explanation was chillingly simple.
What did she say?
They didn't like her anymore and didn't want to be friends with her.
A premeditated, brutal murder, planned with tools and cleanup supplies, and executed with lethal malice, all stemming from the desire to simply end a friendship. How did the sources even try to rationalize that staggering lack of motive?
The sources suggest that the motive, or rather the lack thereof, highlights the profound psychological disconnect of the perpetrators. There was a level of toxic resentment that just festered between the pair of them. A resentment that led them to believe that the only possible solution to dissolving their trio was the permanent, violent elimination of the third party.
So it wasn't about jealousy or theft or some complex adult motive.
No. It was the ultimate cold consequence of a broken teenage bond. It was an utterly insufficient reason for the tragedy that unfolded, and it speaks to a level of calculated emotional indifference that is just difficult for a typical person to process.
So with Rachel Schoaf's confession and the recovery of the body, the legal process moved forward pretty rapidly. Let's start with Schoaf, who was the first to face accountability.
On May 1st, 2013, Rachel Schoaf pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. Her formal admission to the court detailed that she had, and I'm quoting here, unlawfully, feloniously, willfully, maliciously, and intentionally caused the death of Skylar Neese by stabbing her and causing fatal injuries.
The second-degree plea. What does that signify here?
It indicates that while she admitted to the malice and the intent to kill, she wasn't charged with first-degree murder. That charge often requires a higher standard of premeditation or perhaps a lot of mitigating circumstances after the crime. Her cooperation was a factor.
What were the immediate outcomes of her plea?
Her family issued a public apology through their attorney acknowledging the immense grief and responsibility. Schoaf was formally sentenced on February 26, 2014 to 30 years in prison.
And the critical detail there is her parole eligibility.
Right. She became eligible for parole after serving just 10 years of that sentence, which reflects her cooperation in that second-degree plea.
Before we move on to Shalia Eddy, we have to address a devastating piece of information that was revealed during the court transcripts. It speaks to a terrible missed opportunity for intervention.
This is maybe the most painful insight from the source material. Testimony revealed that other students at University High School had actually overheard conversations between Schoaf and Eddy about their plot to kill Skylar.
They overheard them, but they didn't report it.
They didn't. Those students failed to report the information to any adult or authority figure because they just dismissed the talk. They believed the girls were just joking or, speaking in idle hyperbole.
That failure of vigilance, the inability to distinguish a real threat from teenage dark humor, is just a heavy consequence of those social dynamics.
It is. It underscores a profound failure in critical thinking within that social circle. It's an agonizing detail, knowing that the plot was discussed openly enough to be heard, but was disregarded because of a misplaced assumption that they were just being melodramatic.
If just one student had taken those comments seriously,
the entire tragedy could have been averted.
Turning now to the second perpetrator, Shalia Eddy. She was publicly identified as the second alleged perpetrator on September 4th, 2013. The sources confirm she was quickly charged and tried as an adult, despite being a juvenile at the time of the crime.
Right. Eddy was indicted 2 days later on September 6th, and she faced the most serious charges. 1 count of first-degree murder, 1 count of kidnapping, and 1 count of conspiracy to commit murder. Initially, she pleaded not guilty to all of them. She was planning to take the case to trial.
So why did her defense strategy suddenly change just before the trial date was set?
Well, her trial was slated for late January 2014. Eddy faced an immense legal complication because of the state line issue. The planning happened in West Virginia, but the murder was executed in Pennsylvania.
So she was facing charges in 2 states.
She was facing the prospect that Pennsylvania authorities might file separate additional charges, which could potentially complicate her future incarceration or any appeal process. So Eddy chose to change her plea. On January 24, 2014, she pleaded guilty to first-degree murder.
And that plea deal consolidated the prosecution in West Virginia.
Exactly. And it prevented additional charges from being filed across state lines.
What was the sentence she received for pleading guilty to first-degree murder?
Shalia Eddy was sentenced to life in prison with mercy. This specific phrasing is important, and it relates directly to a major Supreme Court ruling that impacted sentencing for juvenile offenders nationwide.
Can you elaborate on the legal context there, the life with mercy part?
Certainly. In 2012, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in the landmark case Miller v. Alabama. This ruling stated that mandatory sentences of life without parole are unconstitutional for juvenile offenders, even in murder cases.
And why is that?
The Supreme Court recognized that minors lack the same cognitive and emotional maturity as adults. That requires courts to consider the possibility of rehabilitation. Because Eddy was only 16 at the time of the crime, West Virginia law had to adhere to this ruling, ensuring she had a possibility of parole, even with a life sentence.
So life with mercy means she's guaranteed a review after a specific period.
Yes. Eddy was mandated to serve 15 years before she became eligible for parole consideration. And the source material notes that she expressed no remorse during the entire process, which is a factor that's often considered in parole hearings.
For you listening and seeking some closure or the current status, it's important to clarify the situation for both women almost a decade later.
As of the sources updated in September 2023, both Rachel Shoaf and Shalia Eddy are incarcerated at the Lakin Correctional Center in West Virginia. We have their specific custody information, which reinforces the finality of their confinement.
Let's start with Rachel Shoaf.
Rachel Shoaf, with her official inmate document ID 3573506, is serving her 30-year sentence. Her current projected release date, pending successful parole hearings, is April 30th, 2028. She had a parole eligibility hearing scheduled for May 1st, 2024.
And for Shalia Eddy, the maximum sentence is much longer due to the first-degree conviction.
Shalia Eddy, OID 3573487, is serving the life sentence. Her next parole eligibility hearing is set for May 1st, 2028. The sources list her projected release date as January 1st, 3000, which is the institutional designation confirming the remainder of a life sentence, subject, of course, to the possibility of parole after she serves the required 15 years.
Those custody IDs and dates are crucial technical details.
They are. They underscore that while the family lost their daughter, the perpetrators face the full weight of the state's judicial system.
The legal consequences for the perpetrators are only one part of this story. The enduring and ultimately positive outcome is the legislative change that corrected the procedural flaws exposed by Skylar's disappearance.
Yes, the creation of Skylar's Law.
This law is a direct, practical response to the systemic failings we detailed earlier.
It specifically targeted those 4 restrictive criteria that prevented an immediate Amber Alert for Skylar Neese, the mandatory 48-hour waiting period for teenagers, and the necessity that the child be believed to be abducted.
Because authorities focused on the runaway classification, the system just prevented the urgent response that could have mobilized the public and police immediately.
Exactly. The bureaucratic rigidity meant that unless there was clear initial evidence of a stranger kidnapping, the textbook definition of a crime, a teenager, was essentially left on a 2-day bureaucratic waiting list.
Which was deemed unacceptable by the Neese family and the legislators in their district.
Right. And the reform process began quickly. A West Virginia state legislator from the Neese family's district introduced a bill specifically named Skylar's Law, identified as HB 2453.
What was the core philosophy behind it?
It was straightforward. Prioritize child safety over the specific details of the disappearance. The old system required certainty that a crime had occurred. The new system focused on the child's danger level.
So what was the functional, crucial change that this law implemented within the West Virginia Amber Alert system?
Skylar's Law mandated a significant expansion of the criteria. It required that immediate public announcements must be issued whenever any child is reported missing and believed to be in danger, regardless of whether law enforcement initially suspects kidnapping or whether a crime has definitively occurred.
So it effectively erased the ambiguity caused by the runaway classification for endangered minors.
It did. It essentially closed the loophole related to that mandatory waiting period for teenagers, recognizing that time is life when a child is missing. It eliminated the administrative roadblocks. By focusing the criteria on child in danger, it allowed authorities to trigger that massive public response mechanism far faster, based on risk assessment, rather than requiring positive proof of abduction.
Which is often impossible to gather in the first hours.
Impossible.
The need for this common sense reform just resonated deeply, and it drove extraordinary political consensus.
The sources emphasize the swift and unanimous support this bill garnered. It received significant attention from both state and national media, highlighting the severity of the flaw it was intended to correct. On March 27, 2013, the West Virginia House of Delegates approved Skylar's law with a vote of 98-0.
A unanimous 98-0 vote in any legislative body that really speaks volumes about the compelling nature of this case and the clear need for the update.
It truly does. And the process continued rapidly. On April 12, 2013, the West Virginia Senate also unanimously passed the law. Although some minor technical adjustments were made, the House accepted those changes the very same day, demonstrating zero political opposition.
And it was signed into law.
Governor Earl Ray Tomblin officially signed Skylar's law into effect in May 2013, less than a year after Skylar's disappearance.
So this is the profound legacy of Skylar Neese. Her tragic loss forced the state of West Virginia to install a necessary and effective safety net for future vulnerable youth.
That is the enduring analytical conclusion of this case. This tragedy led directly to a practical procedural improvement. It transformed a system designed for a narrow definition of missing children into one that is far more comprehensive and responsive to the realities of modern dangers, including those posed by someone known to the victim.
It's an instance where painful knowledge was directly applied to procedural justice.
Exactly. Designed to save lives by preventing the systemic delays that hampered the initial search for Skylar. This successful reform ensures that her name is permanently linked not just to a tragedy, but to a vital improvement in public safety response. It elevates the conversation beyond just the criminal act. It shows how the critical examination of institutional procedure can yield positive social change, honoring Skylar's memory by protecting others.
We have meticulously examined the source material concerning the case of Skylar Neese. The initial portrait of this bright teenager, the appalling betrayal and premeditated murder by Shelia Eddy and Rachel Schoaf, the complexities of the legal procedures, including sentencing under the Miller v. Alabama ruling, and of course the crucial legislative legacy left behind in the form of Skylar's law.
The final point of reflection for you, the listener, I think it has to center on that chilling detail found deep within the court transcripts. The fact that other students overheard conversations about the murder plot but consciously dismissed them as nothing more than a joke. This case serves as a sober and essential reminder of the profound necessity of critical thinking and of the responsibility of social vigilance.
The failure to take those conversations seriously, to question the assumption that violent talk is just hyperbole, was a devastating missed opportunity that contributed directly to the ultimate tragic outcome.
This incident highlights that while laws like Skylar's law address institutional failure, individual accountability rests on our ability to discern genuine danger and act on our instincts. We must question the darkness that can hide within seemingly ordinary relationships and never assume that conversations threatening violence are merely idle talk. That vigilance is the final safety net, protecting what the legal system sometimes fails to catch.
Thanks for listening.